Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this session on modern slavery due diligence. It's a lunch and learn. So for most of you will be familiar with these approaches. It's literally just sort of 45 minutes that will give you an overview of what's happening at this present moment in time around modern slavery due diligence, some practical applications, if you like. So we are your presenters today. You can see us on the screen. So we have myself, Helen Carter, lead consultant and sort of school advice, if you like, for the supply chain sustainability around sustainable procurement and modern slavery. Paul, do you just want to introduce yourself? Say hello to everybody.
Yeah, good afternoon all. As the screen says, I'm Paul Sim. I'm Technical Services Manager for Slave Free Alliance, a company which now looks at business and how we can hopefully change the world with regard to modern slavery and how we can make life improved for the victims and also for business.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Paul. So we'll be your hosts with the most this afternoon while you're chomping on your lunch. And fundamentally, we are here to talk to you about due diligence from various different perspectives, from the businesses and supply chains perspective as well. Before we go into the main content, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping for you. So great to see over the 100 mark. So we've got a lot of people who are all being very chatty as well to say afternoon on the session today, which is great. So what we've done is obviously switched all your cameras off because I literally don't have enough screen space to see you all, and microphones have been muted, which means if you have a question, please can you put that in the Q&A section that you will see in your bar, if not in the chat, and I will be both facilitating and presenting today, so I'll keep my eyes on that, and we'll be doing questions at the end of the session today. We have a Menti poll halfway through, literally just to make sure you're still awake, so please get involved in that if you can. So use your Menti app, which you may be familiar with by now if you've been to these sessions before, or obviously www.menti.com, and I'll share the code nearer the time. We will send slides round, and this session is being recorded, so we will obviously make sure the recording is available if you want to forward that on to your colleagues as well. So housekeeping done. You may or may not have been to some of these sessions before. If you have, welcome back. If you haven't, you're halfway through and hopefully you'll find something interesting. And this is a series of events that we've been running for the utility sector, who are working collectively as a group at the moment to try and work out how to help businesses, yourselves amongst them, on anything to do with modern slavery. So we've already had two, which you can see recordings on if you've missed them, which is a basic introduction to what we're talking about. Modern slavery statements, policies, and the registry, so that technical aspect of what businesses should be doing. Today, we're going to delve further into what due diligence is and what it should look like within your organizations and your supply chain. And we'll cover a couple of things that you should be thinking about, such as risk assessments, mapping, which we'll cover in detail, or more detail, shall we say, on the 16th of February. And then finally, when we start to get into the really big picture, we'll be looking at the sort of international context at this present moment in time around things like just transition, some of the issues in the supply chains that you're involved with in March. So it is part of a series. If you've missed two of them already, please feel free to look at the videos. If you've been to those before, then welcome back. So basically, we have two of us today. There'll be Paul in a moment to talk to you about what due diligence is in business. And then for those of you who know me with my procurement background on, I'll be looking specifically then at procurement and how we look at some of those technical aspects in procurement. And we'll finish off at the end, probably around about 22, to look at any questions and answers. So feel free to keep them coming in your Q&A and your chat throughout the session as you see what we're doing. So without further ado, Paul's introduced himself. I'm going to shut up. Paul, can you just say next slide when you need me to go to the next slide? But I'm going to hand over to you.
Will do. Thank you, Helen, and good afternoon, everybody, to those that have just recently joined. What is due diligence in business? When I talk about this subject, please, rather than repeat it continually, it is about modern slavery. It is about human rights, and it's about the safety of the victims, ultimately, and how we can make life better for those that are being exploited within business entities. That aside, we can't be naive enough to forget about the reputational risk to business. and about business in general, and how doing the right thing for modern slavery and tackling it throughout your business and your supply chain, how that can benefit your business. So next slide, please, Helen. So what is due diligence in business? A definition, and it is quite a dry definition, but it's about due diligence is an investigation, audit or review performed to confirm facts or details of a matter in consideration. In other words, the exercise of care that a business must take when entering that contract with one of their suppliers, setting the standards, setting the terms, setting the conditions, all around what that business's expectations is that the supply chain must adhere to with regards to modern slavery. So next slide, please. So after that, what does it really look like? It's the efforts undertaken by a business to identify potential problems, risks or unexpected liabilities in a supplier's business and supply chain, to find out where those risks of modern slavery are, where the gaps are within the supply chain, and the potential problems, areas where modern slavery is and where it's likely to appear, and identify where those systemic risks lie. So we've identified your problems, we've identified the area, how do we mitigate and manage such issues? Risks, a lot of people are fearful of them. They're not necessarily a bad thing. They help business develop and they help people develop by tackling them through management and mitigation. Risks can be managed and don't necessarily need mitigating. It all depends on the risk level that sits behind it. But it makes it easier if that risk can be mitigated, i.e. let's lessen that risk and make it more manageable. We can manage it through the installation of actions, through remedial practices and through the revisit to the risk to ensure that it's not increased. So don't just forget about it once you first touch upon it and think this is medium risk, this is high risk, this is low risk. That risk level can increase, it can decrease, so always keep an eye on it, especially around modern slavery. It can be mitigated through putting processes in place to tackle the issues behind the risk, such as training, awareness, escalation processes, remediation processes, but by increasing knowledge to people within your business and your subsequent supply chain, it increases their understanding of what the problem is, of what modern slavery is, and they know what's expected to them in that tackling of it, and ultimately to try and resolve that problem. It's about bringing in all stakeholders within the required variance of skills. So those individuals that sit in different areas of business, who can you tap upon? Who can you get to try and build or extend your efforts in relation to tackling modern slavery within the business and the supply chain? It's about collaboratively tackling the issues, understanding individual commitment required, and how efforts in different areas can be brought together to provide that more holistic approach. It's about understanding your supplier's commitments to the terms, to the conditions and the expectations that are placed upon them around modern slavery. What is the knowledge? What is their awareness? Without that, where do they even start to tackle the problem? Where do they even start to contribute to your social commitment to the problem of modern slavery? Do they have the capacity to tackle issues such as modern slavery alone? Or are they a relatively small and medium enterprise that perhaps can't manage it within? Do they need that assistance? Do they need that guidance from yourselves and from the larger businesses out there? Can they realistically meet those terms and conditions that are placed upon them? Or are they just giving lip service? And this means the larger businesses as well. When you set your terms and conditions and they tick the box to say, we will adhere to them, we will comply to them, are they really? Or do you test that response and make sure that they are doing what it says on the tin, that they are doing what you require of them in order to not just set your standards as a minimum level, but take it forward and have that continuing improvement and get things right within your business, but ultimately within their business and their subsequent supply chain. It's about setting action plans to develop suppliers. If they're not reaching the grade, then let's help them increase that, and let's help the likelihood of victims being identified and subsequently rescued from their exploitative situations. It's about including modern slavery in supplier reviews. It's about finding out what they're doing with their own supply chain. Are they just tackling it within their business, or are they reaching down and empowering their suppliers to also assist in the overall goal, which is to reduce modern slavery and hopefully eventually eradicate it? It's about carrying out other processes, more intrusive ones potentially, such as gap analyses, such as site assessments and supplier assessments, finding out exactly what people do. But ultimately, it's about protecting your business from these issues that may result in your reputational or operational damage. The next slide, please, Helen. So where should this be undertaken? 3 processes: the tender process, when you're first looking for those suppliers to provide the goods and services that you need; the onboarding of that supplier, so that given that opportunity when the first integrated into your business and your business practice, and throughout the continuing supplier management. With regards to tendering, when you're looking for suppliers, don't just look at the product, don't just look at the price, look at their social and ethical and environmental stance, look at what efforts they invest into modern slavery and tackling that in their business and their supply chain. Look at their level of awareness and knowledge. As I said earlier, without that awareness and knowledge of modern slavery, how can you expect them to tackle it? How can you expect them to invest efforts into it? Where you identify those who fall short, you've got a decision to make. Will they improve, either with or without your assistance, or will you just discount them? It's all about empowerment. It's all about making the whole industry work together to try and alleviate this problem. When you're onboarding the supplier, look at it's a perfect opportunity for suppliers to be made aware of what their responsibilities are, not just to you as their customer, but also to the whole agenda. They need to be involved in it, and they need to have those behaviours that are required in order to trade with yourselves. If they are to be onboarded but fail or fall short in areas, set the action plans, ensure that, and be involved in their continuous improvement, especially around modern slavery and other ESG matters. This is an opportunity to set the standards and point out the pitfalls for non-compliance. So put it clearly to them. If you don't adhere to these problems, we will address it. If you continually don't adhere to them, then we're going to have to dig deeper and look at other matters or other ways of dealing with you as our supplier. With regards to the continuing supplier management, ensure that continuing improvement, ensure that continuing compliance, include agendas in performance meetings around modern slavery and around human rights, and make sure they're touched on regular, not just to make sure that they're meeting those minimum standards, but that your suppliers are they're over and above those minimum standards, and their efforts are focused on tackling modern slavery collectively. Ask suppliers to report back in relation to any potential incident, rather than put down you must report back with regards to any breaches of law or legislation. Give them that option to report back when they suspect that an incident may occur. So this collective approach between you and your suppliers and your supply chain can be made, and it's a far more effective approach than dealing with it in silos. Create that culture and that relationship where identifying issues can be seen as a positive rather than a negative. It can be seen as working together to tackle the overall problem, but ultimately work with your suppliers. And the next slide, please. So why should it be undertaken? It should be undertaken to know where the risks are, know what efforts are being undertaken, and more importantly, what efforts are being taken to tackle them, to know where further improvements are required. Know the capability of your supply chain. It's understanding your supply chain, understanding those potential problems, but it's knowing your supplier's response to such issues. So it's finding out, what can they actually do? Are they a small and medium enterprise that are limited in their efforts? Do they need help? Do they need encouragement or assistance with improvement? Not all small businesses that don't necessarily have a modern slavery agenda will be reticent to it. They just need that push, they need that help, they need that empowerment in order to take this forward. It's about ensuring suppliers are not just box ticking. I touched on this earlier. So it's the level of supplier compliance to terms, conditions and expectations. It's about when they sign that piece of document or those contractual conditions, that when they sign them to say, we will adhere to this, making sure that they're actually doing what they say they will. It's by testing those areas, by looking at policies, by looking at processes, by looking at the supply chain and mapping it appropriately to make sure that efforts can be made in proportion to the risk level required. It's about ensuring that that commitment is there, not just in relation to your business, but that commitment to across the agendas, to ensure that they sit in alignment with vision expectations, your visions and expectations, but also that towards a holistic problem. To make sure that all can be done to identify and deal with the risks, such as modern slavery, and make sure that we are protecting those subject to exploitation and protecting your reputation. And it's all about getting that buy-in from your suppliers to ensure that they want to be involved in this journey, that they've got the tools and the capability to react to it. The next slide, please, Helen. So what is it to be gained from for your business or your area of business? It's about understanding to provide the opportunities. It's to have that opportunity to show your leadership, to show your and enhance your brand reputation, to protect your business and its customers, to display your commitment out there to modern slavery, to ensure that the jobs you create and support are safe and don't involve exploitative practice. It's about sending that positive PR message out. It's about showing your ethical stance, being transparent in your efforts, making sure that people can see what you are doing. It's about making your business more attractive through the display of that commitment to not just modern slavery, but other social, ethical and sustainable requirements. It's about mitigating potential damage to your reputation. We've all seen businesses that have had their share price cut overnight as a result of adverse media or adverse reaction to an identified problem. It's about making sure that and showing to your customers that you're not cutting corners and that it is safe to trade with you, and you are a company which is ethical and has a need to be traded with. It's about your commitment to your emotive and your sustainable agendas, highlighting your ability to react to certain agendas. So it's making your business one which people want to work for and trade with, setting that positive culture and wanting to do the right thing. That's to eradicate modern slavery and also identify those risks and deal with those risks. The final slide, please, Helen. So what are the pitfalls of not carrying it out? As I explained earlier, it's about reputational damage and loss of brand protection. We see constantly in the media where brands have fall foul and they have had incidents of potential modern slavery identified as belonging in their business and subsequent supply chain. And then we've seen how share prices can plummet overnight as a result of this being discovered. We can see the loss of sales due to the lack of confidence in their customers with regards to the company and their ethical principles. It's about the cost of issues being found through loss of revenue, cost of the legal requirements that subsequently follow, and any legal litigation. It's a cost of efforts required to try and save the reputation of that brand. There is an evidence link between ethical links and investors and share price. Make yourselves attractive to such investors and shareholders by showing your positive ethical mindset and what you want to do as a business, and how you're quite happy to work with empowerment with your suppliers and their supply chain. And ultimately, it's about employee morale. It's about setting that culture within your business where people want to come and work for you. People want to do the right thing. People want to be involved in identifying people who are subject to exploitation, and they want to help these individuals. And it's having those processes in place within your business in order to drive this forward. And that's it from me, Helen. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. There's a couple of questions which I'll hold to the end, but that gives us a really good overview of the sort of principles of due diligence, the reason behind it, the sort of things that you need to be aware of. I'm going to go now and delve into some of that in a little bit more detail, looking specifically at the procurement process itself, and some of the things that Paul's touched on there in terms of the tendering process, the supply management process, giving some examples of things that are really useful to think about, and some documentation that you might want to go away and have a look, and that might help with a couple of the questions that we've seen on board. But before we do that, if you're familiar with Menti, and that's a poll, let's go on and have a look at Mentimeter, and get a couple of questions from you in terms of what you're currently doing around due diligence, what activity you have underway, some of the challenges you have. So there is a code of 15124927. If you put that into your Menti poll, and then the first question is ready to go. If we have a look, I think there's only 3 questions, so it's really straightforward, but just to give us a good idea of where you are at the moment around the sort of due diligence response. So the question, as I said, 15124927. I've got loads of answers coming in for the first one, and obviously we talked at the last event around the modern slavery statement, and that a good modern slavery statement really is about taking everything Paul's discussed and what we're going to do in a moment, and putting it into that statement. What are you delivering on? So let's have a look. We've got no, we're not legally required to, because remember, that's the bit of the legislation that applies to the 36 million threshold. We have, I think, but I haven't read it. That number is usually huge, so it's great to see that being a number quite small. So those of you who have obviously have read it, which is good. We have one, but it's written by an individual or an individual department. Again, we see this with due diligence legislation, due diligence approaches, modern slavery approaches, it's the role of Florence in the corner. She's the one that does it. Or the next one we have, which is, well, we have a statement and it has that multi-stakeholder, multi-departmental approach, which is obviously the best practice that we're looking for. So, wow, a brilliant response. We have most of you that have them, that have at least got them written by somebody who vaguely knows what they're talking about, or alternatively, even with the stakeholders. And I've run these sessions for years, probably as has Paul, and in the earlier days, it was very much at the other end. So it's great to see that we now have this much more stakeholder approach to the way you're dealing with the modern slavery statement, and obviously the associated due diligence that goes with it. So, okay. Paul's talked about a number of due diligence activities that you could undertake. What have you done so far when it comes to your supply chain? So have you put stuff into your procurement policy? Have you risk assessed your supply chain? Have you mapped that high risk supply chain? Have you put questions in your PQQ process? Have you put anything in your ITT process? Have you audited your suppliers? Have you trained your suppliers? Have you included any of it in your supply management? You can choose as many of these as you want. If you've done them all, great. If you've done a few of them, that's brilliant. If you've got no action at all yet, then hopefully we'll inspire you today to go and do a few things. So let's have a look. Let's see where you are. Interesting, very interesting. So again, when we see maturity, what we tend to see, and I have this a lot with my clients, and I'm sure Paul has it with his clients as well within the consultancy businesses, give me my pre-qualification question. What can I put in my policy that basically shows that I am being responsible when it comes to modern slavery? They are the two quick things that most organizations immediately go for. So I'm not surprised to see that those are high, because they're usually the first places that people go. What I am pleased, however, to see is that we do have my particular passion is supply management, is the fact that you're having the conversations in the supply management process, that it's included in those. So that's a really good number that I like to see in there. And also really interested in the number that have risk assessed your supply chain. So how many of you have actually started to look at the risks in your supply chain, whether that's at tier 1 or whether you've gone further into the tiers. Great to see that that figure is so high. So there's an evidence of maturity here, which is really good. But the reasons you're here, because it's probably not running as smoothly as you want it to, or there's some hurdles. So the last bit, excuse me, little word cloud. What are your challenges? Why is this not working as well as you want it to, or what's stopping it working as well as you'd like it? What are the challenges? And this is a little word cloud, so pop me some words in, just don't swear. Don't say bloody engineers, something along those lines, but give me some real feeling for what you think some of the challenges are around due diligence. Is it time, knowledge, complexity? Thank you. Laborious, seriously, it's fun. It's a really interesting subject, but it is very, very long-winded, I admit. The technology hasn't really quite picked up yet, although things like blockchain and stuff are starting to gather momentum in terms of giving us data to enable us to do that. Understanding, yes. Resource. Anybody involved in procurement probably would be going, yeah, there's not enough for us just to simply buy stuff, let alone look at what's going on in the supply chain. So that is a key. How do we prioritize? Processes aren't always followed. Yep, some people just don't care. Some people just will buy what they want anyway, regardless of what we're doing. Resources seems to be a big, small organization. Yeah, if you're a small company, it can seem a bit daunting, but actually understanding your position and where you are in the supply chain is really important. Devolved contract management, yes. One of the key areas that I see, and we'll look a lot more at this in the risk in February, is this role of suppliers, subcontractors, contract managers. The structure we have in construction means that it's kind of easy to go, it's their job in terms of understanding some of these issues. So yeah, new to the role. Okay, if you're new to the role, hopefully you got some ideas. So some really interesting, very lots of conversations in there. COVID, yes, has been a big challenge, but also a big risk for our supply chain that we need to be thinking about. Okay. Well, let's very quickly go into some specific examples of things that you can do. And also, just to flesh out a little bit some of the stuff that Paul's talked about, we've mentioned why due diligence needs to happen along the reputational risk, although within construction, we have a murky supply chain, so sometimes we can get away with that. But the reality is laws are coming. Laws are coming daily, weekly, monthly, yearly when it comes to due diligence, and everybody wants to know about supply chain due diligence. As Paul's already alluded to, one of the challenges that you have now is that due diligence isn't just looking at modern slavery, it will be now starting to look at the environmental performance as well. So even if you don't want to look at modern slavery, all the other stuff's coming in. So laws are coming. What we're also needing to do is look under the bonnet quite a lot. When it comes to what's happening, and people are starting to say it's a nice flashy car, but I want to see what's underneath. I want to see how it's working. And the media examples that Paul's talked about, the media reputation is huge. We are now starting to see lawsuits. That's the first time over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, we're starting to see enough prosecutorial evidence. We're starting to see enough momentum in really starting to linchpin on the back of that Modern Slavery Act requirement, which is basically the ability to sue people who've been sue your exploiters, or people who haven't done their due diligence. You've heard me talk about BIFA before. Paul will be familiar with that one because Hope for Justice were very instrumental in helping in that case. But we are seeing globally legislation coming in now that is basically allowing people who've had horrendous exploitation sue the people who've not looked after them properly. And regardless of what's going on, due diligence is important to enable us to ensure that we've done everything in our power to address those issues. So looking under the bonnet is becoming more and more important. Interestingly, literally this morning, so I was busily updating the slides, there's a really interesting report that we just put onto the supply chain school around people's responses, organizational responses to due diligence. And in the 5 years that we've started to look at this and really understand what's happening around due diligence, it's still really interesting to see that we've got organizations taking no steps or very basic steps, training steps, still trying to get to grips. And your challenge word bubble explains why some of the businesses are really struggling to get to grips with how you get into your supply chains. In terms of purchasing practices being updated, I'm still not seeing that extensively. When you're updating your purchasing practices, even from a sustainability perspective, what are you considering in your purchasing practices? All the way from the moment you need it to disposal, everything in the middle should have gateways that start to bring in key issues around modern slavery and human rights. And how we do that is still not really being addressed. So it's slow progress. Interestingly, there's a document that's been written since 2016 that almost gives you the answer when it comes to procurement. So what we did within the school, when the school launched this area of expertise, we actually produced a procurement guide that talks about this, and it specifically asks you to do what Paul's mentioned about risk assess, understand where your risk is. That's the one saving grace that you've got within this area, is that you're not expected to solve all of the world's problems. It doesn't mean that you can use that as an excuse to hide behind, I just look at tier one, but understanding the risk, understanding what you need to do is really, really important. So the event in February will go into that in a lot more detail, because when you come to your procurement strategies, they're really influenced by the risk, by the leverage, by what you need to do. You can follow a technical approach, which we'll go through in a second, or you can take that strategic approach, that collaborative approach, which might need a longer approach to addressing the issues. So conduct your risk assessment, and then obviously wherever you are in the procurement process determines what you're going to do. So if you undertake your risk assessment before you procure, then the process Paul's gone through is perfect. Onboarding, getting them the right suppliers, embedding it in your tender, putting it in your pre-qualification, thinking about your contract terms is the way to go. But in some instances, you may have suppliers who are on long-term agreements. So actually, you don't have the opportunity to do that. It's much more about going into supplier development, working with them more collaboratively to be able to arrange that. So assessing your risk and where it is in the procurement process helps you understand what strategy to use going forward. The other thing when it comes to doing this is you'll hear a lot about supply chain mapping, risk assessing. And again, as I said, we'll go into the huge technicalities of how to do it. But the key is to look at where your risks sit. If you look at things like the UN Global Compact, if you look at the advice from them when it comes to businesses, even they say take a risk-based approach. Consider your leverage, consider what you're doing, consider your supply chain in its bigger entirety and what impacts you have. And when you're doing that risk assessment process, consider who's involved. It isn't just about supply chain getting involved. You will have requirements that are given by engineers, get them in. You'll have requirements from contract managers, get them in. Everybody needs to understand what that risk is. Once you've done that, start to get into your supply chain mapping. I know some of your projects probably have 20, 30,000 suppliers. If you try and map all that lot, yes, your resources are not significantly going to be enough. So actually mapping your supply chain is a long, burdensome process. So focus on those risks, focus on where you need to start to really get to grips with understanding your supply chain. And as Paul's already alluded to, you get a huge amount of benefit from understanding what's going on, not from just modern slavery, but we've done it for Brexit, we've done it for COVID, so why can't we do it for something like this? Start to understand how you get in. There was a question earlier on about how we go beyond tier one. Things like mapping help you, but it is a long, laborious process. There are organizations out there that can help you, but it really is about getting under the bonnet of your tier ones, asking them who they're working with, and then connecting the dots. And for that reason, slow progress is fine, because you really do need to build up that momentum. And there are systems around that can help you visualize that. But the reality is, in most cases, it's about mining data, understanding where your supply chain is, who they're using. And there's a huge growth at the moment in companies that can do that. The other thing as well is use intelligence. There is literally a multitude of intelligence online. You could go in and there are softwares that you could type in a company's name and it'll tell you the news. It'll tell you what exposés have been involved with. I've seen some of the best procurement activities that use this as a way to drive intelligence. But the key is to take that intelligence and analyze it. It is not your answer. So when you're putting your procurement strategies together, don't just pick up a newspaper that tells you that this company's suddenly been in the middle of a modern slavery scandal. Use that to start the conversation. Use that to understand what exactly has happened. Was the business actually a victim of exploitation themselves? Were they a victim of criminality, or were they complicit? How did it work? And did they do everything they possibly can? The reality is that all these things you'll find online will give you a really good conversation to have, but they are always going to be skewed. They're always going to be skewed to the people who are providing it. So use that intelligence. There is actually a lot out there when you're bringing all your procurement strategies together. What you then need to be thinking about when you're coming into that procurement bit is to think about the risk and the activities that you are looking for. So in some instances where you have what we call a green risk, well, we'll do a green, amber, and a red, amber, and green risk. A green risk being that there's very little risk. It's something that you can just literally put into a contract terms. You can put it on your website. You expect everybody to comply with your base minimum, and everybody's quite happy. If you've then got a medium risk, which is into Paul's mitigate and manage, where you sort of need to have a look a bit more extensively, then your procurement strategies might be a bit different. You might be embedding it into things like your pre-qualifications, bringing it into your tenders, looking at your negotiations, thinking about your KPIs that you want to measure on them. So it's much more in a management approach to the way that you're doing it. If you have a huge red risk and it's something like you have no idea what it is, or there is a risk of that supply chain happening later on, then actually looking at a more strategic approach to how you work with that supply chain is important. So your strategic suppliers, having a look at them, thinking about whether you could do the mapping, whether there are social audits that you could undertake, whether you are looking at much more of a collaborative approach to the way that you work hand in hand with them. And as Paul's already alluded to, getting into those behaviors is really, really important. So it is not one size fits all. It's not about sticking one ITT and tender question in a document and expecting that to find you the answer. It is about understanding the complexity. And whilst I can feel some of you going, what the heck, that's a lot of work, it's just good procurement practice. It's the way procurement tends to work. So Paul's already mentioned the sorts of things. You've understood your supply chain, the risk, you understand what strategies you're looking for, and then fundamentally what you need to do is look under your next supplier chain's bonnet. What are they doing? And when you're thinking about the questions, thinking about what you need to put into ITTs, into metrics, into measurement, it all hinges around the due diligence system. What you want to know is exactly what you're doing, but is your supplier doing it? And when I say supplier, I also mean subbies. I mean subcontractors, I mean, service providers. Anybody who provides you goods or services is a potential risk to you. So once you've understood who they are, you want to understand what the supplier is doing about accountability, around recruitment, around training, around engagement, around grievance, all the things that Paul's mentioned, you need to have in your organization as part of your own internal due diligence, but you need to assess as well for your supply chain. So think about your question sets, and a good way is to start thinking about how you phrase your questions. So we've mentioned in there the fact that you can put it into your pre-qualification. And a lot of times I've seen suppliers basically have a question that basically says, have you got a modern slavery statement? Have you got a modern slavery policy? Well, yes, anyone can write those. The reality is that you want a question that really starts to get underneath that bonnet. So it's about details of approach. It's about evidence. So in that document I showed you earlier on, it gives you an example of a really good question you could use for pre-qualification, which is, please provide details of the approach your organisation has taken to address or exceed requirements of the Modern Slavery Act. You can even change that to address modern slavery and human rights. The key here is that what you're looking for is evidence and activity. Giving some thinking around what that response could look like. So a poor response would come back and go, I don't know what you're talking about. or no, the Modern Slavery Act doesn't apply to us, we don't have due diligence, we haven't got a policy, or we've got a policy, tick, here it is. Good response then starts to go into actually investigating things that Paul's talked about, the action plans. They can provide you those sorts of details. They can talk about training, they can talk about how they're engaging with their supply chain, talking about things like toolbox talks, for example. And then a best practice really starts to give you a good idea that a company's got experience in, you know, working with organizations, NGOs like Slave Free Alliance and other organizations, working and addressing these issues in the supply chain, dealing with whistleblowing, helping victims, really good victim-centric evidence of what they're doing. But the key to your pre-qualified question is evidence, not policy, not statement, but evidence, and having a think about what that poor, good, and best practice response helps you assess going forward. You then need to think about the tender. So the tender question does exactly the same thing. But remember, from a pre-qualification perspective, pre-qualification is all about capability and capacity. What can you do? What have you had experience in doing? Tender is, what are you going to do for me? What are you going to do in this contract? This is the bit that you can then linchpin your contractual terms and relations on. This is the bit that basically says we will do. So from a procurement perspective, an example here is we're committed to identifying and eradicating instances of exploitation and modern slavery within its construction supply chain. Provide details of how you will take action to identify and mitigate these issues during the completion of this project or this contract. It could be anything from, we'll train our key staff, we'll monitor and measure, we'll have a look at our tier ones, through to the best practice being, yep, we've not only got the fact that we'll do tier ones, we can map, we can identify subcontractor material risks, we can tell you through the delivery of this contract where our risks sit and how we've mitigated it. So again, what are you going to do? How is the experience going to be able to deliver, which can then translate into your contractual terms going forward. Somebody's mentioned about KPIs. Good way of being able to do this around measuring KPIs is to start thinking about what you need that KPI to do, what data you need from it. If you are dealing with things like PPN 06, so are dealing with any sort of central government departments, the social value requirement where they're looking at modern slavery, they do have specific KPIs around positive impact for victims. It's very much what we call the outcome-based metric. But actually, you can use metrics internally to start thinking about how much of your supply chain have statements, how much of your suppliers have attended raising awareness, how much of the workforce has had training, how much of the spend have you risk assessed, how much of it have you gone beyond tier one, how much of it have you got beyond tier one for a full audit. There's a range of different types of metrics that you can use that start to influence those behaviors Paul talked about earlier on in terms of how you measure that going forward. And again, the document that we showed you before, the procurement one, that we'll send some links out to, it gives you some examples that you can use that help you understand some of those areas. There is obviously the power of audit, and we love audit in this industry, audit everyone to death. But be aware that obviously, as we've talked about in earlier modules, you know, the complexity of modern slavery is that actually you could audit somebody tomorrow, they could seem fine, and then the day after you suddenly find a huge problem. And we've seen this a lot when we start to look at compliance audits. So think about the role audit has to play. Train up some of your team to understand what to look for from a procedural perspective, but also consider the fact that when you're asking your supply chain to do due diligence, that they need to start looking at those softer touch audits as well. So we do see a lot happening on projects where you might be working in a single project, or you might have a series of refurbishments that you're looking for. Then think about site drop-ins, conversations, things that you do to actually start to understand what's going on. It's not such an audit, it's more of a health check, if you like. So audit is not your only answer and never really gives you a clean picture. You need to make sure that you've got a real good picture going forward. So in terms of things that we've got within the school, obviously one of the things you could do when you've got all that question, because I can hear you going, hello, that's great, but there's a lot of work in that. How would I know a good answer and a bad answer? we have a due diligence checklist, which basically gives you sort of key things to think about at each stage of that procurement process. What does a good policy look like? What would a good training answer look like? What are the key things I need to do around sort of grievance and mechanism? That's free and available for you to use. So again, download that, have a look at it, and use it going forward. It takes that due diligence approach and really starts to give you some examples of what you can do. So I can see some questions coming in. Before I do that, I've mentioned the procurement guidance. We have a mapping one, which we'll go into a little bit later in more detail, and the due diligence checklist. So I will go into that in more detail in the February event. But these are good documents to go and have a look at. And if you come into February's, have a look at them first, and then obviously come back and give us some questions specifically to those. Always talk about People Matter Charter. Go and have a look if you haven't already signed, and I can see some of you rolling your eyes. I will never stop talking about it. But again, it's a way that organisations are holistically bedding modern slavery into due diligence across the whole thing, not just modern slavery, but training, human rights, well-being, fairness, inclusion, and respect, which are all interconnected. And for those of you that don't know, a due diligence standard is literally out for consultation as we speak, and the closing date for that is the 23rd of December. So this is one that's been written by BSI and a number of stakeholders that looks at all your organizational due diligence, what you should be doing at recruitment, what you should be doing internally, what you should be doing within your supply chain, and is now available for comment. So do go and have a look. And there will be a webinar on the 28th of January where the standard will be going into that in a little bit more detail. And if you're not fed with me now, you will be by then, because I'll be doing the procurement piece. But do go and have a look at that and put any comments in, because it is a really good standard that helps you understand what due diligence looks like from organizational top to bottom throughout your supply chain. So we have a time for questions and answers. So I will open that up in a moment. As I've said, we've literally given you an overview of what should be contained within your due diligence and some examples of what to look for. Hopefully some links and things that you can go away and do a little bit more deeper dive. We do run within the school numbers of sort of like workshops around due diligence, so please feel free to sign up. I know you're probably the same with the Slave Free Alliance as well, but whoever, there are loads of courses. Go and have a look where we can really dive into those thinking in a little bit more detail. But the next piece we will take on the 16th of February is the bit about risk. So we'll take that risk bit that I've seen some questions go into and delve into that a little bit further. So I'm going to open it up to Q&A now. You'll get your feedback form at the end of all this. What I'd like to just quickly do is Maria, sorry, it's my dog in the background. Maria has got a question. Paul, I'm going to ask you this one. The biggest challenge is how to assess and get feedback beyond tier 1. Any guidance, any experience you guys have had on how to go beyond that tier 1?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Maria. It's difficult is the answer, but you can't do it alone. You need to start using your suppliers and empowering your suppliers to help you have visibility of their subsequent tiers as well. It's, as Helen alluded to earlier, it's about the mapping process to get that initial risk assessment. But once you've got that, it's about digging into those suppliers. And the best way to do it is through your direct supplier and see what they are requiring. See what standards, terms and conditions they're setting down, and see how their supply chain are reacting to that. It will give you an awful good insight as to the commitment of that supplier also. So it's easy to do the odd or the occasional audit, social assessment or social visit to one of the tier 2, tier 3 and beyond suppliers. Can you do them all? Not realistically yourself. So it's about engaging everybody that you can and hopefully empowering others to carry some of those actions out yourself, or themselves, should I say.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. Jonathan, I'm going to take this one. Do you think that complex PQQ and ITT questions on modern slavery will inadvertently exclude resource-constrained SMEs? Interesting question, Jonathan. it depends on how you want to interpret them. The reality is that it's about what we call the performance level. So the idea is that actually it should help SMEs, because fundamentally it's not about a policy, it's about what you're doing, and you do something that's proportional to your business. So regardless of the systems that we've just used in here, an SME can still train, can still use stuff like the supply chain school where it's free, to train and upskill their organization. Your policies don't need to be big and complex. I've actually had conversations myself with SMEs who work with ex-victims, old victims who've been rescued, who then work with homeless, who work with vulnerable organizations. The key here is that if you put a load of standards in, that can actually stop an SME. But if you can talk about what you do, then as long as it's relevant to your business, it should help. I think the challenge with these little bit more woolly, some people procurement say, is that we need to help SMEs understand what that response looks like, that it is proportional to your business. It is about what you do, talking about how you can help. And that's where we need to help clients in this space, I think. One for yourself, Paul. Do you know of any certification for auditing that would be beneficial for auditors in this space?
It's difficult. It really is difficult on this because it's still a growing process. It's having those there is no certification with regards to looking at modern slavery issues, but it's reaching out to those such as Slave Free Alliance and other third sector companies that can perhaps take this forward for you, and it's getting that training. It's having that awareness, as I keep referring to and alluding to throughout our discussions today. It's about having that knowledge and awareness, and it's about, and with it being such a, I know it's only been since 2015, everybody thinks that's an eternity since the legislation came in, but really it's not that far, but it's something which needs to be developed without doubt, but reaching out to industry experts would certainly help you on that.
Brilliant. Definitely endorse that. Another one to look at, though, is the ethical labour standard, which is something that's within our industry, BES 6002. It's linked into the responsible sourcing standard. It's one that is run by BRE. And I know that one is something you can also use and look specifically at, was created as a construction response to this element. So do think about going and having a look at that one as well. Just a quick couple of others before we start to wind down. Natalie, I think you've done this to us. What risk criteria data sources do you recommend, e.g. Global Slavery Index, data sources on categories of high risk spend? Yeah, there's Global Slavery Index gives you a geographical picture. So it will tell you the countries of high risk, but the sophistication of the supply chain mapping work, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in February, means that actually you can pick up a country that looks like it's got low risk, but there'll be pockets of high risk contained within it. So it's all about building that intelligence level. I personally, and Paul, if you want to add some more, I'd look at the Global Slavery Index. I would look at the people like the Business Resource Human Rights. I would actually look at media for reports of businesses. There's a lot out there. So places like LinkedIn are a really good source of information around that space. Those places like Slave Free Alliance and Hope for Justice that are constantly doing case studies on things that they find. Places like Unseen, constantly sending reports. The Rights Lab in Nottingham, Sheffield. There is actually a wealth of resources out there. So I'll try and see if we can put a list together in time for the next report, next section we do on risk and mapping, which will hopefully help within that. Can you think of any others, Paul, that you'd recommend off the cuff now?
The other one off the cuff is the US TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report, which gives a little indication into more specific areas, rather, and not geographical areas, but business areas, and such as construction and all those and commodities, that's a useful document to read through as well. Brilliant.
Snowia, hi. I've seen you've done a question about, as a client, how should I allow my contractor, staff to come to us as a whistleblower where they see signs of modern slavery? Have you got any good practice examples of that, Paul, where supply chain's been involved in that process?
It's all dependent to the size of your business and the capabilities to respond to that. It's a difficult thing to say yes or no, do it. if you can do it, brilliant, because not only does it give you knowledge and awareness of what's going on in your supply chain, it allows you to become part of that remediation process as well. And there are clients, certainly of Slave Free Alliance, that have touched upon that, and it can be very, very effective. But capability is a word that comes to mind with that, and whether or not your business has the capacity to actually respond to it. But it can't do any harm. It can never do any harm. The more avenues there are there to whistleblow, the better.
Yeah, and again, from my experience, Paul, I don't know if you found this, just be careful when you have whistleblowing as a way to respond to this. That capability piece, that you've trained the whistleblowing people to know what to do, rather than just, yes, we have a general whistleblowing helpline, tick, we've got it done. And again, this goes back into that sort of being careful with your due diligence systems, thinking about how they all work together. And remember that fundamentally, the victim is the center of everything you're trying to do with this due diligence. So if your whistleblowing helpline doesn't know what to do, doesn't know who to call, then the victim's not going to get help. So, use them, but use them wisely, I think, is a way to talk about it, to echo Paul's point.
Absolutely, and it's wise to have some kind of triage process as well, because not everything always looks as it first appears. So certainly around modern slavery, it can be disguised into a number of things. So to have that triage process is beneficial.
Brilliant. I'm just trying to see if there is any more questions. For a few people who said, can I have the slides? Yes, we will be sharing these slides. And as I said, we'll hopefully share the recording, although I didn't hear the American lady say that she was recording at the beginning, so I'll check that with Rosie. I think we've answered most of the questions. Sally, your question around standard list of questions to ask per low, medium, high level. There isn't really a standard set out there, but maybe use that diagram that I showed you with the green, red and amber bit in terms of the approach. Standard, green being a simple question around policy, up to that sort of, not just a question when you've got high risk, it's beyond questioning, it's more into that sort of let's get close together type conversation that you'd want to have, and hopefully that'll help in that space. Other than that, I think that means we've given you 3 minutes of your day back, which is always good. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Paul for being part of this.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for joining.
And thank you all for joining and taking time out of your lunch, or while you're eating your lunch. Do look out for the 16th of February event, and there is a link to the consultation for the BSI piece, so please do go and have a look at that. Really keen that gets looked at, but in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope this has been useful. Thank you.